This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Right On, showcasing the work of Otago Southland writers. I'm Beverly Martins. Join me for news and interviews with local writers on the second Wednesday of every month from noon till 1 and replayed the following Sunday at 1 p.m. Right On is brought to you by the Otago Southland branch of the New Zealand Society of Authors and kindly supported by the great team at the University Bookshop.
What do you want to be when you grow up? They say you are what you read, and the University Bookshop can help you be whoever you want to be. Do you want to be an athlete? Then sit down with an inspiring sports biography. Do you fancy yourself as a detective? We have a grisly lineup of murder mysteries waiting just for you. Do you aspire to be the world's greatest chef? We have cookbooks to tantalise your taste buds. Do you want to celebrate your inner child? Play up in our fabulous children's room. The University Bookshop, helping you decide what you want to be when you grow up.
Hello and welcome to Right On with me, Beverly Martins. Well, they say that truth is stranger than fiction, and what you're about to hear on this show certainly totally supports that. I've got two cracking interviews about two astonishing but true tales set a century apart. Firstly, Professor Wendy Parkins discusses her award-winning novel, The Defiance of Frances Dickinson, set in 19th century Victorian England and based on a scandalous true story. And then later I chat with emerging creative non-fiction writer Hannah Bulloch about her highly entertaining family saga of her grandparents' astonishing travels with 6 children in a homemade house truck from Dunedin across Asia, Europe and all the way to the Isle of Skye. And get this was happening in the 1960s. So buckle up and let's go exploring. So here I am with my first guest, Wendy Parkins, talking about The Defiance of Frances Dickinson, which was published in November of last year. So in fact, a year ago, Wendy.
That's right.
And the reason I particularly wanted to talk to you was that you recently won Best First Novel at this year's Nio Marsh Awards. How did that feel?
Surreal. Yeah, it was. I went to the event in Christchurch for the experience and to meet some other writers, not expecting that I'd have to do anything more than that. So it was a lovely surprise.
Brilliant. Actually, because, and I'll call it Defiance in this interview because, you know, The Defiance of Frances Dickinson is slightly wordy for radio, but it's definitely not, I mean, it would have been surprised in the sense that it's definitely not your average crime novel, is it? So how would you kind of sum it up for our listeners? What would you say it's about?
Yeah, it's not a whodunit, but it is a novel about crime and criminal behaviour. And the particular interest in that crime for me was that it was actions and behaviours that are considered criminal now, but were not at the time in the 1840s. And given that this is primarily about abuse, various forms of abuse within marriage, and a resourceful woman who was trying to find a legal way to extricate herself from an abusive marriage, I found that fascinating, that this sort of behaviour that she was being subjected to, it was a real fight to have that recognised as crimes against her and therefore as any kinds of grounds of separation.
I mean, it wasn't, you know, people wouldn't even talk about it.
No, of course.
You know, let alone then want to question it or,
exactly.
You know, move on from that point. It just would not have come up. It would have been, you've made your bed, lie in it, literally.
Yes,
scenario
yes.
back
And
then,
that
wasn't
was,
it, for
that
women?
sort of circular argument kept being used against her, that she, as a lady, should not have even been talking about this kind of behaviour, and yet she wanted to say, this has been done to me against my will.
And she wanted to say help.
Yes.
Yeah, so It is a novel, but it's kind of creative nonfiction in many ways, in the sense that, and this is the important thing, is that, of course, we can write any story we like if we are, doing it from imagination, but you weren't. This is actually inspired by a very shocking true story of directly from court documents. Is it Giles or Giles?
Giles, I believe.
Yeah,
yes.
with the J. Jeeves and Worcester. Giles versus Giles, which was published and in the newspapers and things. It was quite the tale of its time, in quite a degrading way for Frances. But how did you? So it's important to realise that this did actually happen. And the second thing is, how on earth did you first come across it?
Well, Frances had another life after all of these terrible events. She became, in later life, a very successful travel writer. And moved in literary circles. So I first came across her through her travel writing because prior to starting to write fiction, I was a professor of Victorian literature, so with a particular interest in Dickens. And Frances became a very good friend of Charles Dickens and as I say, a very popular and successful travel writer. So I knew her in that way first, and then I started to come across these. Not much has been written about her, and then I found these sort of passing references to her scandalous marriage. And the more I looked into that, first of all, took me to the Times newspaper archives, where, as you say, the court case that resulted from all of this was reported almost verbatim in the Times from the late 1840s into the early 1850s. It all dragged on for a long time.
That was the other interesting thing, is not only did she, go through that process, but it was not a short process.
That's right.
That really struck me about it, actually, is it just went on and on and on. And that was even bringing it to court. We're talking decades here.
Yeah. And it was multiple court cases, and she was a very wealthy woman, or she would never have been able to pursue any of this action, and absolutely determined to pursue it. So it went through courts in both England and in Scotland, where she lived for much of her marriage. And so, yes, it was all reported in the newspapers, as all the sort of scandalous court cases were. And then I found, digging a bit deeper, that the actual archive, legal archives in London, still contained all the original court documents, the witness statements, and everything that had been given in evidence by both sides in the court proceedings. So that included a lot of Frances's letters as well. So it was a huge archive of real historical documents to work from, which was absolutely fascinating.
So one of your previous jobs is, you are still a university lecturer here at Otago, but you were Professor of Victorian Literature at the University of Kent. Why does this era interest you so much?
Well, that's a whole other program. Ever since I was, I discovered 19th century fiction as a teenager, that just has been my thing. So from, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Thomas Hardy, the Brontes, this was what I grew up with reading, and I found at university that you could just keep doing this. So that's what I did. But I guess more generally, the 19th century has so many links with our own time. Like, we think of them as being very sort of, prim and proper and very different from how we are now. But so many of the sort of roots of our modern ideas, whether that's feminism or environmentalism or socialism or,
or just general morality and manners.
Yeah, it's all coalescing in that period, but also constantly being challenged and debated, and I've just never stopped being fascinated by that period of history. So that was an obvious area to turn into fiction for me.
The other thing, though, is that, as you say, all the documents are there, and that's fantastic, and it's a huge resource, but it must have been overwhelming for you to then think, how do I turn this into a novel? What do I leave in? What do I leave out? And the epistolary, the nature of telling it through letters. How did you come onto all of that?
Well, one of the models that I was working from was the Victorian novelist Wilkie Collins, who wrote sensation fiction around the same time as this story takes place. And when I came across the facts of Frances's story, my first thought was, this reads like a Wilkie Collins novel. Oh. He wrote about, disastrous marriages and, various legal complexities, but turned them into very kind of gripping, sensational stories. So I was struck by how much this true story sounded like one of his novels. And one of the devices that he used was often multiple narrators to tell the story from all different points of view to build up this kind of complex and gripping account. So that was a starting point. And then it was because of things like the witness statements that I was reading, where a lot of the evidence in the trials came from servants. So the witness statements were from servants and family members and people who'd sort of observed behaviour in all sorts of settings. And they had such strong voices in these witness statements. It was like,
characters. They became characters.
They did very much become characters. So that was the structure that seemed to me to tell the story. But also because there are still things that, there's a lot of the evidence that's in conflict. There's gaps in the story that I still don't quite know the truth of. So what I wanted to do was to present the reader with a range of voices, a range of sources, and leave some space for readers to sort of draw their own conclusions.
Now, something that struck me about the letters, though, and this was nearly her undoing, in the sense that the letters between her and her husband are ultra polite, very much my dear, sticking with the manners of the time, saying things but not saying things, a lot of passive-aggressive stuff going on. And that was almost her undoing, because if you just looked at those on the surface, you'd think, what's the problem? Nothing to see here. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, you can see there are moments in the letters, particularly letters to her mother, where she's a bit more honest. But even writing to her mother, she's often, presenting a very positive view of her life. There are very few letters in the archive written by the husband, and some of those are very sort of strange. They don't say much.
No.
They don't give much away.
No, they're veiled.
But when she starts to pursue legal action, one of the things that one of her lawyers says to her is, don't put anything in writing anymore. I put that in the book. Then that's actually, that she reported that after that she was told, be very careful what you put down on paper from now on, because, that can be used against you.
But, of course, letters were the main form of correspondence. You weren't going to send off a quick text or that you could delete, or, a phone call that couldn't be recorded. She didn't have access to those things. I mean, letters were it.
Yes, or you'd send a messenger.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, and I couldn't, in lots of ways, I couldn't work out who Frances was. I found her frustrating in some ways, in that you weren't, you sort of, she was kind of a bit disingenuous and a bit naive in some, but then you remember she got married at 18 or something, and she expected one kind of life and had another, and then was really quite powerless within it. But I did emphasise with her, with the various miscarriages that she had, the brutality in the marriage, but also just the frustration of it taking years and years to extract herself. And also, kind of on top of that, there was that double jeopardy thing that she was, if she gave in to him, she was going to lose her money, lose her fortune. That automatically became his. She needed her fortune to get away from the marriage, but the cost of that might have been losing her children.
Yes.
Her daughters.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, certainly she had no legal claim to her daughters at that stage. Obviously, legislation changes as the 19th century goes on, and it became a little bit easier for mothers to retain custody of their children. But at this time, no, and he did threaten her with that. That he would take the children. And it was pretty clear to me that his only interest in the children was that if he had the children, he could get the money as well.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. I mean, what was quite obvious with his behaviour throughout the book is that he's a philanderer, and thank God, because that was, that sort of became, the basis for the court cases and things. Now, you obviously don't shy away from challenging projects, Wendy. Your 2019 memoir, which I'm yet to read and really looking forward to reading, if that's the words, Every Morning So Far I'm Alive. Now that's gutsy because just the title is provocative, because it's about anxiety and depression. And in a different way, this novel goes to some pretty dark places too. What I want to know is, how do you detox from writing about these kinds of things? One, you were putting, your heart on the line with your memoir, and now you're putting someone else's story kind of on the line for judgment in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you cope with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, writing the memoir was a form of therapy. It was a very therapeutic process. So the writing process was a really important part of healing and recovery. But this, as you say, is someone else's story. And I do retain a very strong interest in trauma and what it does to people, and how you can recover from trauma. And I think that was the other aspect of Frances's story that I was drawn to, was not only was the abuse she suffered not recognised as such, but also her experience was never recognised at the time as trauma. And you can see the way, I think I can see the way that trauma damages her as her life goes on, and her life beyond this. There's a whole other story of Frances that I'd love to tell as well in another instalment, but you can see, I can see that the rest of her life was different because of what she had been through in this marriage.
Because, you've got the personal trauma, and then you've got the societal trauma on top of that.
Exactly.
That she was, telling tales out of school, as it were.
Yes. Which is why she became a travel writer, because she felt she couldn't live in England anymore.
Yeah, she essentially exiled herself. But we should say to readers that there is a kind of happy ending.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah, through her daughters and where she lives and what she does. And as you say, that's how you got to know her, later in her life. And then, and really that, in terms of the scope of her life later, as people remember of her, that, what you've dwelt on is kind of skipped over. Well, not quite skipped over, but not, in her obituary and stuff like that.
Yes, it's just not recognised.
It's just not there, is it?
Yeah. And she remains, a defiant woman throughout her life. I think quite a difficult woman, but that very much defines her.
But also there is that lovely last line in the book, "I must leave my readers to make their own sketch of me."
Yeah, which is a direct quote from something Frances wrote.
Yes,
so
I like that. Yeah, I like that, because she's not, she's not apologising either, is she?
No, absolutely not.
Great. Okay, well, can I ask a couple of final questions then? You're always busy because you're reviewing for Landfall, and you gave a really great talk at the Landfall Symposium, Wendy. I really enjoyed listening to that. You've got your academic work. Have you got any other creative projects on the go?
Yes, I'm about a third of the way through another historical novel set in the 1850s. That is taking a character from a Dickens novel and
Oh, give it a spin-off.
Yes, a spin-off, exactly. And thinking about what might have happened next for her. And among other things, she's going to find her way to 1850s Dunedin. So that's what I'm working on at the moment, having a great deal of fun with that.
Haven't you got a lovely life that you have? Well, no, I mean in the sense that these passions, you evoke them as a teenager and you've been able to, I'm going to make a joke here and say you've been able to put off getting a real job for all this time. Of course I don't mean that, but what I mean is that you've been able to play in that space and live in that space and earn a living from that space for all this time.
Yeah,
that's
and
terrific.
Yes, and writing novels now is just really the most fun I've ever had. So, I hope to keep doing that.
Just make sure you ground yourself in between
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's brilliant, Wendy. Well, thanks for coming in to tell us about that. Congratulations again on winning Best First Novel at the NIOS for The Defiance of Frances Dickinson, which is available in all good bookstores now. So thanks for coming in, Wendy.
Thanks, Beverly.
Now, before we hear from my next guest, I want to do a shout-out to a great friend of the show, Barbara Else, and warmly, personally congratulate her on winning the Prime Minister's Award for Literary Achievement last week, and that is so well deserved. It's a worthy recognition of her body of work and other writing-related achievements in her long career. And last year, I was congratulating another local writer, journalist and geographic writer Neville Peat, who for winning the same award, proving yet again that Dunedin harbours a wealth of writing talent. But I also mention Neville because he plays a pivotal role in Hannah Bulloch's project, which we're going to hear about soon, so listen up for that. And then separately, shifting gear somewhat, I also want to thank Dr. Mira Harrison for organising our branch event this coming Saturday, November 15th, at the Otago Farmers Market, to acknowledge the Day of the Imprisoned Writer. So please go and say hello. They're down at the market all morning, and find out more and see what you can do to support writers who don't have the same freedom of speech around the world that we do here and we often take for granted. So now let's hear from Hannah about her grandparents who took freedom, and I mean that in the sense of freedom camping, to a whole new level, travelling back around the world back in the 1960s. Now, I'm talking with Hannah Bulloch. Lovely to chat with you, Hannah. We are talking about her upcoming book, which will be launched later this month, and it's called Overland to the Island, New Zealand to Skye with 6 kids in a homemade house truck. Now, that kind of says what it is on the tin, doesn't it, in a way? But can you just do a bit more of the what and who it's about, please?
Sure. Yeah, kia ora, Beverly, and thank you so much for having me on the show. So the book is about my grandparents, Alan and Joan MacLeod, and their 6 children. So they lived on a farm outside of Dunedin, and my grandfather had a really strong sense of his MacLeod clan heritage. Both his mother and father were of the MacLeod clan, and he wanted to visit the MacLeod clan homeland on the Isle of Skye, and in particular Dunvegan Castle, and visit his chief, Dame Flora MacLeod. And he also wanted to revisit places that he'd spent time in during the Second World War. So he was an artilleryman in Italy during the Second World War.
So what?
But rather than the No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say what makes it so completely extraordinary, though, is that the era in which it's set, which is the the early
Yeah,
1960s,
so
isn't it? Which makes this whole thing, completely unusual.
Quite unusual.
Yeah.
That's it. So in 1962, he began building this house truck out of a collection of old military and other vehicles on his farm. So, in those days, most people would, if they were traveling overseas, they would sail, or increasing numbers of people were flying by that point. But my grandfather decided he wanted to go largely overland. So he decided that he would build a vehicle himself, because he needed it to be something that would deal with tough terrain and accommodate all 8 of them, the himself, his wife Joan, and their 6 children. So he used the chassis of a World War II armoured scout car, the cab from a city bus. It was actually too small for the scout car chassis, so he had to bisect it down the middle and build in an extra segment, and a tractor engine to kind of give it the grunt that it needed to get over rough terrain. My grandmother canned 400 tins of home-killed meat and fruit and vegetables, and they stocked their caravan with, sacks of oats and milk powder, cheese. They were taking so much dairy products out of the country that they needed a dairy export license.
Wow.
And then they put it on a ship to Singapore and travelled insofar as they could. They travelled largely overland to Scotland.
Yeah, and an incredible route. You're right, because at that time the travel one might have been the once-in-a-lifetime cruise to Fiji when you'd retired kind of thing. Like it was still the sort of glamour age for people, and short known trips. I mean, this was all a largely, unless you were sort of, and even the hippies weren't doing it yet, were they were about a decade later.
Yeah, it was kind of just the very beginning of the hippie trail. It hadn't really begun in earnest, and I think one thing that is difficult to fully appreciate today is the dearth of information that they had about where they were going. And in fact, they couldn't really figure out a lot of things, regarding their route, what was possible and so forth, until they were there. So they just kind of tried things, and we'll try to travel up here and see how far we get and so forth.
So let's talk about the key characters, because they are fascinating in and of themselves. Even if they hadn't done this trip, you would have probably wanted to write a family story about them. So your grandfather, I mean, obviously he was incredibly innovative, enterprising, biggest, best moustache in the country. I mean, the Movember guys will be, weeping when they see his moustache. But he was also a bit bloody selfish at times, wasn't he? And the thing about taking the kids was a kind of a 50-50 decision, wasn't it? They could have thought about not taking them, and in fact, I think they did. Because remember, you're talking about children aged sort of early teens and a bit below.
Well, the youngest was 5 when they set out, and the eldest, at the time they set out, was 15. And that was
that's your mother.
Yeah. So, they were mostly young kids, all sort of, in between. And my grandfather did investigate the cost of putting them in boarding school, and, he decided that was too expensive. And he actually said, it'll be a damn sight cheaper to take them with us. So, but, he did talk to journalists as well at the time about some of his motivations for taking the kids. And he said, he thought it would be an unconventional education for them, that it would toughen them up. I think for him, it was like army life all over again. And he thought that it would help to build resilience in the children. And he wanted them to sort of, explore the world and get to know different life ways. He wanted them to connect with their own clan heritage as well. And and to actually understand some of those sacrifices that New Zealand soldiers had made in Italy and other parts of the world during the Second World War. So I think there was kind of this wide range of reasons. But yeah, he did like to save money. He was quite frugal. So.
And yet the kids were, they already had a pretty good work ethic, didn't they? They lived on a farm. They'd had lots of chores before school. They then would walk to school. Then they'd come home and have lots of other chores, and they were raising livestock, and so they were already quite resilient.
Yeah, I mean, they had this kind of regimen of hard labor in a way. So it was, the farm was definitely a family effort. They had about 600 animals, I think, and each of the kids had their row in the pig pens of the animals that they would look after. They would raise their own animals as well and take them to the Burnside market and Dunedin on the weekends, and saved a lot of money that my grandfather actually requisitioned for the trip. I think I worked out that my aunt had about the equivalent of about $18,000 in today's money.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That would have helped. And your grandmother, I mean, she was petite but not sweet, I think, as she's described somewhere along the line. But she was also incredibly pragmatic. I didn't know about the canning the tins thing until you just mentioned it then. But, I mean, she was well organised, had to be, frugal, had to be. And also I think she sort of put up with a lot because she was always kind of promised a new kitchen that never arrived because there were other improvements to always be done. So that was a big consideration for her going on the trip too, wasn't it, in the sense that she was going to be, it was going to make feeding the kids even more challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, my grandmother, Joan, she was a really strong woman, and she was living under difficult circumstances. I mean, they bought their farm. They met directly after the Second World War. They bought their farm in 1949, and when they moved there was no electricity. They had only a tap that just would trickle water. Sometimes she had to wash her hair in the creek, and they had in terms of their kitchen, it just had an open fire and some fire bars, some hooks on a fire bar. So, they didn't even have as much as a coal range when they first moved in there. So life was really tough. Like a lot of people, they were trying to sort of build up, rebuild lives after the war. And in terms of the travel, I would love to know more about what my grandmother thought of it. My grandfather did have, he was quite determined. And I think she did say that, it was really, he was driving it, but she was interested in traveling as well. She talked a lot about how she would have liked more of a kind of comfortable suburban existence. So she was I think my grandfather was very lucky to find someone who kind of went along with his plans in spite of everything. And it was tough, because she's looking after a family of 6 kids on the road, and my mother actually was kind of her main helper. So,
yeah, she was 2IC, definitely, wasn't she? And your mother sort of grew to resent that a little bit, didn't she? In the sense that she was 15 and had aspirations beyond sort of housework and things, didn't she? She was a reader and
That's it. My mother was quite different from the other kids. Well, she spent most of her time, inside the house rather than outside, and she was, helping with the cooking and cleaning, having to boil laundry in the copper on the weekends and that kind of thing. And she she was intellectual, and she wanted to do her homework. She wanted to read. She wanted to go to university. And for her working class parents, they kind of didn't see the value in university. So eventually, she kind of went her own way, and I had a big argument with my grandfather and said, well, bugger it, I'm.
Yeah, I did read that bit and I loved it. So there's 2 things that's great about your mother in this story. One is that, after 5 years on the road on this trip and everything, she kind of leaves the family in Penang, takes a boat and plane and gets back to New Zealand and then works to get some money and goes to university. So that's a lovely story. But also you have to thank her a lot for keeping the travel diary that she did, because, that's quite the basis of the story, isn't it?
It is. It's incredible that she, at her young age, she kept that diary and she wrote in it every single day, and she wrote so much detail about the places they went to, the people they met, how far they'd travelled, what they'd eaten for breakfast, all sorts of things. So that really has formed the basis of my narrative, and has kind of given me a point of reference that I could then ask people about, things in interviews and follow up various things through other sources.
Now, I had to laugh because you said that you initially thought this project would take a year. We laugh about that now because, in fact, it took 9 years. Now, but I want to go back to when I first met you, which I think was 2018 or 19. I'm not absolutely sure.
Yeah, or maybe 2017, I think it was, if it was when I was a writer in residence.
Yes, that's right. You were the inaugural University Bookshop's emerging writer in residence, and that turned out to, and you awarded that because of this project, essentially, yes, weren't you?
I was.
Yeah, and how serendipitous that turned out to be, that residency. I mean, not just because you got you got accommodation at the Robert Little Cottage and you were able to start working on it, but really it was the people you met, and I'm thinking of two in particular, Rachel Scott and Neville Pete. Do you want to just fill our listeners in on those connections?
Yeah, I mean, just coming back to your point that the project took a lot longer than intended. So I actually did write about 80,000 words in the first year, and I did that as part of an MA in creative writing at the International Institute of Modern Letters at Victoria University. And then I was felt quite fortunate to be awarded that writer's residency by the University Bookshop and Robert Lord Cottage Trust, because I didn't have any published creative writing at that point. I was an academic and have a background in social anthropology. But so they were doing that based on a writing sample and showed a great deal of faith in me, which, was so important to help kind of
move it along and keep you in love with it.
Yeah, exactly. But it was serendipitous, as you say, because the bookshop arranged for me to do a reading of some of my draft work, and as it turned out, Rachel Scott and Vanessa Manhire, who were publishers at Otago University Press, were there, and they got in touch with me later and suggested that I put a book proposal to OUP, which I eventually did. And so now the book is coming out with Otago University Press. Neville Pete was actually a long-standing family friend, although I hadn't met him until I started this project. He had been a journalist for the Evening Star back in the late 1960s and had interviewed my grandfather on many occasions, had written stories about them, and had written up quite a bit of this kind of, they actually did 2 world journeys in the end, so he wrote up quite a bit of that, and that's been an amazing source of information as well for this book.
Let's talk about the research, because I'm amazed that you didn't get completely overwhelmed, because you were very thorough and you went to various different places. You had so much source material. Tell us just about a couple of the specific research things that you did overseas. And then, if you could, can you kind of tell us how you found the eventual structure and how you managed to kind of put it all together in one book, because it's almost like a series. It could have been.
Yeah. I think when I started out, I was a bit worried that I wouldn't have enough information because, like my relatives, my grandfather and my grandmother had passed away in the early 2000s, and so I couldn't interview them about it myself. And when I started out, I didn't know, how much information would be out there. So I thought that some of it might end up having to be quite speculative and so forth. But in fact, I just kept finding more and more material, letters, diaries that we didn't know we had. I even found my grandfather's war diary, for example, and that connected in with places that my mother talked about in her 1963 diaries. So I could see that they were going back and visiting some of the same people and places that he'd spent time in during the war. And yeah, so I mean, I think my background as a social anthropologist really helped here because I had some of the techniques to kind of, I guess, organize all of this information and be able to find it when I needed it to kind of create a rich story around that. But I also didn't want it to just be a story of this happened and this happened and this happened, you know.
Yeah, we stopped here and then we stopped. Yeah, you didn't want it to be the travel route, did you? You wanted to broaden it out with the people.
Yeah, that's it. And I wanted to understand why it was that they were doing this trip and how it was possible and so forth. So, you know, I wanted to bring in some of that bigger picture of the, you know, our ancestors coming over from Scotland. I wanted to understand as well what the clan chief, Dame Flora MacLeod, you know, how she was setting up these clan societies all over New Zealand. I wanted to understand the context of Alan's time in the Second World War. And, you know, also a little bit about how the travel impacted on each of the family members and that kind of thing. So the actual, you know, once they set off on the trip and within the book, that was relatively straightforward to write because that's quite chronological. But the first third of the book is actually weaves together a range of different time periods to kind of create this narrative, and we're moving back and forth right from the 1800s through to, you know, today, through to the research journey and quite a lot in between. So structurally that was really difficult to write and get right, and there was a lot of redrafting in there to make that feel smooth.
And what to leave in and what to leave out, because it's scene setting and it's context, and it's actually saying, of course they did the trip because of that. That's who they were in terms of that's where they came from, and you know the whole immigrant self-reliance thing that your grandfather was very strong on, the social mores of the time. In a way too, and you touch on this briefly. It was a slightly unlikely marriage between Joan and Alan too, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was in a sense. I mean, they didn't exactly get along. And as I point out in the book, when my grandfather died, my grandmother said, you know, it's funny that I miss him because we didn't really like each other, but I guess for better or worse, you get used to someone. Yeah.
And there's one wee thing that happens when he literally dies in terms of when he's lowered into the ground, and I'm not going to ruin that for the readers, but your grandmother makes the decision then, and it's incredibly moving. So there was definitely kind of respect, wasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there was. But yeah, I mean, as I say in the book, there's been a bit of ongoing debate in the family about how to kind of understand and assess my grandfather in a sense. I think you alluded to the fact earlier on that, you know, he could be interpreted as a bit of a selfish old bastard, as, you know, one or two of my relatives have certainly said, but others sort of contest that and want to see him more as a hero who was a really inspirational person. So, I mean, I think from my point of view, like I don't draw a judgment on that in the book, but I leave the reader to make up their own mind.
And I think there's always that tension between someone who is innovative and inventive and, you know, and they might get public plaudits, but they're not necessarily a family man. And in the reverse of that now, women have that dilemma of trying to do well in their careers and then have the guilt of not being, you know, as perfect as they should be at home, you know. So there's always, you know, you can't be all things to all people. Everyone's just trying to do, I think, the best that they can. Now, in this 9 years, you know, you were working on this project, you lived in 3 countries, 8 different houses, had 4 different jobs, including the current one that you've got at the University of Otago, and yet you're based in Sydney?
I'm sort of in between at the moment. Yep, I'm
back
and forth at the moment.
And we won't dwell on this, but you have had your own challenges too with your cancer journey, and that you were diagnosed at 41. You've had 4 major surgeries. How is all that going now?
Yeah, no, I'm doing well at the moment. So yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons that the book took a bit longer than expected, because by the time I had a full draft, and then I had been working part-time to kind of get work done on the book, but then I took a full-time job at the University of Otago, and it's always intense in the first year or two of an academic job, and COVID hit around the same time, and then I was diagnosed with bowel cancer at the age of about 41, and I had an initial surgery and chemo, and that seemed to go quite well. But then the cancer spread. I had a liver resection, and then popped up again. I had another liver resection, and then it kept spreading, and it spread quite extensively. And last year I had 4 organs removed.
Wow.
So at that point, I did actually genuinely think that I wouldn't finish this book. But I'm stable at the moment, and I've recovered, incredibly well from that surgery. I'm working full time. I'm really active and just really happy to be alive. And it's just so delightful to see this book going out into the world now. And
well, you should be well proud of it, Hannah. And what a milestone and what a celebration. And I imagine that there's the bookshop on the night, because I think is it the 27th?
It is 27th of November.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks from now at UBS you'll be launching that, and the bookshop will not be big enough for your extended family. Yep. It'll be heaving in the most lovely way, so you must feel great about that. You deserve to feel great about that, because it's more than your mother's story. It's more than everybody's story, I feel, this book, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, my grandfather said that he, in part, did this journey because he wanted he'd grown up with these stories of his ancestors, and he wanted stories to pass on to his children and grandchildren. And so, it's sort of wonderful to be able to keep that story growing, and it means a lot to the family, and everyone has been I didn't know how they would react when I said, look, I'm thinking of writing this, and
heads up, Hannah, you don't know. You still don't know, because remember, they haven't seen the finished draft. They
have actually.
Oh, have they?
They've read. I gave them an interim draft, and then I gave them the draft at the very end, and so they all read it, and I was able to incorporate any feedback from them, and fix up a few bits and pieces here and there, and they were incredibly supportive of it. So it's just it's been really lovely to.
Well, that's great too, because that's going to mean the launch is even more of a celebration, because no one's kind of flicking through it wanting, oh my God, there's going to be, it's no surprises in the nicest possible way. I mean, it's a surprise for, all your readers, and I'm sure you're going to get lots of them, because it is such a mixture of things, the creative nonfiction, the humour, all sorts of things in there. And in fact, speaking of the humour, we'll get to that in a minute, because I'm going to get you to read out loud a couple of the diary entries from your mother and your aunt. But there was something that struck me in the book, which was your very astute observation about modern travel. So now it's very transactional. It's quite depersonalised, because we're sort of doing it on the computer, and we can look up anything, and, we can look up and see what the bathroom's like and where we're going to stay, what restaurants, reviews of the food, all that kind of thing. So depersonalised, transactional, and a sort of mistrust of strangers is kind of the modern feeling of travel now, that you sort of stick in your wee bubble. The MacLeods were nothing like that. They got in amongst it wherever and they could, because they needed to talk to locals to find out information and things. And also the kids were a complete icebreaker, weren't they? They just rolled off the truck, and people were probably astonished and curious about them just as much as the MacLeods were curious about where they were.
That's it. I mean, people were incredibly curious about the family. They certainly got stared at everywhere they went. They had people crowding around the caravan, and so there was no shortage of people who wanted to talk to them. The kids took it all in their dried. You know, people wanted to touch them. They were these kind of unusual pale blonde children. But many of the places they went, they hadn't seen a European family passing through before, so it was unusual for people. There was also, you know, and the children, yeah, they were, as you say, icebreakers. They made it easier for my grandparents to be able to chat with people as well. And I think there was also an element of pragmatism because, you know, traveling today, you can check into a hotel or you can go to a cafe and that kind of thing. Everywhere they went, they actually did have to rely on the help of strangers. They had to ask people to, you know, be able to get access to water, or, you know, people would offer them somewhere, you know, to camp in their front yard, or would they like a bath or that kind of thing. So, you know, they were meeting people all along the way. And I think, yeah, there was just a lot more trust as well. And in a sense, they kind of had to trust people, but there wasn't this whole industry set up to kind of, you know, industries to set up to scam tourists out of money and that kind of thing.
Yeah, there were no middlemen, was it?
Yeah.
It was raw and happening wherever they were.
Yeah.
Well, let's wrap this up, Hannah. I could talk to you all day because it's a really, really brilliant book, and I'm not near enough through it yet, but I look forward to, and it's a good dip in and out book because of the travel diaries too. But just to show that equally it wasn't sort of Bear Grylls, Man in the Wild stuff. Neither was it A Bed of Roses. Can you just read out some of the diary entries just to show the sort of the tone of what the kids thought some days?
Okay, so this is from my mother's diary, so Marilyn. It's on a ship, the TSS State of Madras, on 16th of March in 1963. She says, "Day went as usual. Dad fixed caravan tyre. In the morning, we called up the spirits and asked famous people about our futures. Alexander the Great was very fierce." And then in Iran, on the 13th of May, she says at the end of one of her entries, "Forgot to mention, the parrot died yesterday, most likely from the cold. Threw him out the window."
Oh, no, that's like out of Monty Python, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then I think there's a couple from your aunt, and then finish with your grandfather's thing about his hat,
Okay.
maybe. Yeah.
So my aunt, Flora, she was 13 years old, and she had these very kind of cute diary entries I think this was in Spain in November. She says, "Forgot to say yesterday that I had lost my scarf, found it, and it had been chuffed in the junk on a very rough road. I cried because I was mad. There is never luck for me." And then on one of the last days of their travel on a ship, the Alabrosia, she says, "Got up this morning, had our breakfast of cornflakes, then packed the rest of our things. Corrine, Marilyn and I went and said goodbye to all the crew and shaked hands. When I was saying goodbye to the first and second steward, I cried a bit. We were good friends and I shall miss them all. Waved goodbye to everyone and then set off in the truck. I was very sad to leave that good life."
That's quite poignant, isn't it? That sometimes they really needed a break from each other in a wider circle.
Yeah. And the one from my grandfather you mentioned, so this was a note on the underside of his hat from the Second World War. It's written, "This hat is private property, not government, and belongs to one Lieutenant Sergeant Alan MacLeod, more often known as Fang. So put it back in one big hurry and take another. Signed and bloody well meant, Lieutenant Sergeant A.M. MacLeod."
He didn't suffer fools, did he?
No, he did not.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, congratulations again, Hannah. So the book Overland to the Island, it will be available in a couple of weeks, and it's about the MacLeod's journey from New Zealand to Skye with 6 kids in a homemade house truck back in the 1960s. It's much more than that, but that is the essential essence of it. Really looking forward to seeing you back over here, Hannah, at the launch, and congratulations once again on such an opus, such a saga, and such a brilliant family legacy.
Thank you, Beverly. It's been lovely talking to you.
And that's our show. Thanks to my brilliant, interesting guests, Wendy Parkins and Hannah Bulloch, and of course, UBS. Now I'm going to wrap things up by playing a few bars from Bikranga's Sway. Why? Because I asked Hannah to pick her favourite music track, and she recalled hearing this back in a supermarket in the Philippines in 2005 when she was feeling very homesick. And then suddenly that track lifted her when almost every Filipino around her started quietly singing along. And that, my friends, is the connection of art that we all seek and thrive on. Ka kite.